Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, and probably good afternoon to all the distinguished speaker, guests, and friends. Thank you for watching this webinar, Global ESG Trends to Watch How to Invest in the Era of Climate Change. Please excuse my weird voice as I'm still recovering from my first Omicron infection, as all of other panelists and colleagues behind this webinar. I'm Helena Shaw, in charge of Columbia Global Center's Beijing. The Beijing Center is the regional hub in China of Columbia University, aiming to facilitate and promote academic exchange and research collaboration between Columbia students and scholars with their counterparts in the region. So the subject today we're focusing on is a critical one. The ESG investment skill and regulation factors are demonstrating its unparalleled significance worldwide. Using China as an example, according to my research of the forecast of China International Capital Corp Limited, aka CICC, the scale of ESG investment in China is expected to reach 20 trillion to 30 trillion RMB in 2025, accounting for 20% to 30% of the total scale of the asset management industry. Among them, the scale of ESG public offering funds will reach about 750 billion RMB in 2025 and about 900 billion RMB in 2026, with an average annual compound growth rate of 29.2%. So in the meanwhile, regulatory policy and discourse guidelines are being introduced at an accelerated pace. At present, the China Security Regulatory Commission requires companies to disclose ESG-related information mainly on a voluntary basis. However, the number of A-share list companies that disclose social responsibility report or ESG report is increasing year by year. The statistics shows that there are 1,130 A-share list companies that will disclose ESG related reports in 2021. But 2 years before that, the number was only 371. So beyond the real life consideration, ESG investing has a much greater significance than analyzing investment return alone. So considering that ESG investment is such a vital component of investment decision-making, regulatory compliance, as well as humankind's sustainable development and our shared future, we hope to seek in-depth advice from senior scholars and professionals on how to better equip the relevant units with knowledge and tools and to encourage their effectiveness and result. Fortunately, we are very honored to have a great panel today. I will give a very brief introduction by their titles, and then later they can share more about themselves in the discussion session. The first one we have is Professor Bruce Arthur, Elizabeth Strickler, 86, and Mark Gallagly, 86, Faculty Director of the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise. He's also Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Business School. Welcome, Professor Arthur. The second one is our alumni, Stefans, the manager of the Banking Department of the Investment Operation Region 2 at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. AIIB is, as we all know, a multilateral development bank that aims to improve economic and social outcomes in Asia with over 105, I think, state member and growing. Our third panelist is on his way to join us, but I will briefly read his title. Mr. Lan Zhao, founder of Innovation Capital. This capital Innovation Capital focus on investing industry-leading business in the most promising future growth section in China and Asia, primarily in green energy, climate impact, and ESG sustainability, as well as supply chain sustainability. The one who serve as the moderator and drive the discussion today will be Jack Su, founder and CEO of Ivy Group International Incorporation. He is one of the board members of Columbia Global Centers Beijing, a fellow of the 5th class of China Fellowship Program, and a member of Aspen Global Leadership Network. So before I turn the microphone to Jack, please be reminded that our dear audience, if you have any questions or comments during the discussion, please use your Q&A function on Zoom or post it in the chat box on channels.wishing and Bilibili. The webinar admin will transfer them to Zoom for the panelists to review. So now, without further ado, I will turn the stage to Jack.
Thank you, Helena, for that wonderful introduction. So, very warm welcome to everybody on this very cold December day. And for those in Beijing, wish you well. And like many of us, I think we're all either going through or in the middle of our first COVID shot. So hang there. So really excited today to be working with an incredible panel to talk about one of the hottest trends in global asset allocation. I understand as much as 35 trillion of assets are under this category, and it's receiving a lot of attention. So hopefully for today, we'll be able to understand if this trend is for real. Does it bring about real social change? I mean, there's a lot of promise, but as well as a lot of questions. So with our panel today, I'm confident that we'll be able to reach some consensus, or at least different viewpoints about what ESG investment really is about and what maybe it is not. So maybe in addition to Helena's introduction of our panelists, we could invite the panelists to speak a little bit about themselves, particularly in the area of ESG investment. So maybe we'll start off with Professor Usher first.
Well, thank you, Jack and Helena, for inviting me to join this panel today. I'm joining you from New York, and my background is in traditional finance. I worked for many years here in New York City and actually in Tokyo as well in traditional finance. And then about 20 years ago, I began investing in climate finance and climate change related projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that was my first familiarity with the field of what we now call ESG, or some people refer to this as impact investing. In 2009, the business that I was CEO of was acquired by a large bank here in New York. And at that point, I changed careers to academia, very unusual career path, actually. And I became a professor at Columbia Business School, and I'm now a full faculty member at the business school. My area of specialty is climate finance. That's what I specialize in. And of course, climate finance includes ESG as one of several strategies that investors use to tackle climate change. And I recently published a book called Investing in the Era of Climate Change that writes about how investors are addressing climate change, partially through an ESG strategy. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Bruce. Stefan?
Hi, I'm Stefan. Yeah, now that I guess Bruce puts it that way, I guess I started also in traditional finance in New York after school. And I worked in, I guess, traditional finance for a very long time. Until about maybe 5 to 6 years ago, I joined the world of the development banks. And when I joined, there were not a lot of investments into type of public market securities or private market securities. And it was still more development finance based bilateral loans. So I was familiar because of the work in the loan space of how development banks look at environmental social standards. But it wasn't until we got into the capital market space as investors that we started to map out what we had done previously for the development loans into our work in the ESG world, which is kind of the mirror image of what we have been traditionally doing in the MDB space. So that's kind of my path toward ESG. At AIB, which is a multilateral development bank, like Elena mentioned, I am in charge of kind of ESG investments or kind of the capital market space for the bank. Pleasure to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stefan. Lane is here, but he's having some technical difficulties, but we'll have him on pretty soon. So I just want to start off maybe understanding a little bit more about what is ESG investment. You know, I understand for today's audience, a lot of them are students, so they're probably quite familiar with what general investment is, but what is ESG investment or ESG investing in particular? You know, Elon Musk has called famously called ESG investing a scam. I mean, what do you say to that? So maybe Bruce, you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I'll start with my perspective on it, Jack. And I say my perspective because there's not everyone's agreed on what ESG is, right? And that's part of the problem here. And we look forward to hearing Stefan's thoughts on this as well. But I was actually involved in a meeting that the UN organized back in 2004, just by coincidence, really. And it was the first time that investors were brought together to discuss this idea of incorporating environmental and social factors into investment analysis. We didn't know this term ESG, it came later, right? And the concept is really very simple. It's before you make an investment, most investors do a certain amount of analysis. You know, they review the financial statements, they review the management, they look at the competition, and they look at forecasts. And the concept of ESG is simply saying, in addition to doing all of that work, you should also consider factors that are environmental, social, or governance. You should add that to your investment analysis. Why? Because if you do that, you'll be a better investor. It'll make you a smarter investor. And because it will focus capital on companies that are, you know, positively affecting the environment or social factors. So the concept is quite simple, and it's now become quite controversial. And my take on that, we can dig into that more deeply if you'd like to a little bit later, Jack, because I want to hear from the others, is that most of the people who are criticizing ESG fundamentally misunderstand what it is. I think there's really a pretty severe misunderstanding, and perhaps some of that misunderstanding is on purpose because it gets good headlines. I think Mr. Musk perhaps intentionally misunderstands it. But the basic concept is pretty simple.
And I see Lane has been able to join us. Welcome, Lane. And before we actually perhaps let you give us your views about what you think ESG investment is, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience in this space.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack. And it's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Arthur, and also other panelists. You know, I think, you know, my background is, you know, I work in the investment industry, private equity industry for 20 years. I started my career path with Morgan Stanley Asia, you know, in the PE team. And I joined KKR at the beginning of 2006. I was one of the founding team members for KKR's Asia business. I was leading KKR's very first investment, you know, in the we call that green tech or clean tech space, you know, 12 years ago. That's the KKR's very first investment in the ESG space. That company was really providing membrane technology for the wastewater treatment industry. And we grew the business from very small scale into the global #1. And the KKR made like $500 million US capital gain from that deal. And later on in 2016, after 11 years at KKR, I started Innovation Capital. And today we are very much focused on investing in the ESG space, right? I think, you know, I was, you know, apologize for being slightly late due to the technical problem, but when I heard the Professor Usher's comments about ESG analysis, I fully agree with Professor Usher here. Having said that, I think we're taking very seriously on ESG analysis, but not only treat that as additional due diligence work we need to do, right? We do not only require our portfolio to be ESG positive. I think we actually take ESG as a very important investment thesis or investment opportunity. So if you really look at our focus area today, the green tech space is the number one focus, and also the food security, a little bit healthcare. That's really sort of our focus areas. And that's green energy, clean tech space is definitely very important for climate change. So to me today, because of the technology development in the last 2 to 4 years, seems like electric vehicles, batteries, hydrogen, energy storage, the solars, and I think the green energy, clean tech today, the whole sector represents a very attractive investment target areas, and also the growth profile, in our portfolio companies today is kind of like really it's phenomenal, right? I mean, look at our portfolio today. On average, I think last year our latest fund 3, the average portfolio, the revenue growth last year was 140%. So I think to me today, the climate impact or the ESG investing today is not only something good for social impact, it's also a tremendous opportunity from investors' perspective. Also from the returns perspective, I think it's extremely attractive with the return profile on top of that positive social or climate impact that we can create. So I think that's really the point I want to make. So it's really not some additional burden for investor. And really, I think for investment firms like us who have really real deep insights and really sort of that deep connections, knowledges. I think the ESG investing today represents one of the most exciting, most attractive opportunities today in this world. That's the point I want to make.
Thank you, Lane. So Stefan, being a practitioner and being on both sides, you've been in investment banking and now focused on sustainable investment at AIB. Can you give us some concrete examples of what are the differences in your investment decisions that are guided by ESG? How is that different from regular investments?
Sure. So I think we have to let me first pick off on where Bruce picked off. So I think there's a lot of confusion over what ESG is and what it's not. Okay, so and I think Lane just also added to that when he said that he was speaking about really impact investment. So ESG also includes impact, but if you really want to start splitting these things, impact is actually even a higher level of what I will call within that ESG space. And I think, and I mentioned that because not all impact investment, all impact investment would usually have a good ESG angle to it, but not all ESG investments would have a good impact angle to it, right? So it's not a perfect match from that perspective. I think the ESG space, if you look at it from the first part, which is just safeguarding, I think it's just an inevitable part of investment going forward. I think previously, people probably didn't really even recognize or realize that they had to do these assessments for environmental and social aspects of the investment or of the company. There wasn't really any disclosure or look at the governance. And even if there were, they didn't have to disclose it. So I think what Bruce was mentioning in the PRI, the UN got together in the mid, I would say 2000s, and came up with the UN PRI. That gave rise to the rationale for having principles of responsible investments. and setting up kind of what is now kind of the ESG framework. So from that perspective, I think ESG is something that you just cannot avoid doing now. And I think it goes well with the times, as in, there's more increased transparency of investment data. I would also say that technology has made it easier to monitor, but also to report and also share information, right? All these things are probably not available 20, 25 years ago. So in an era where you're just sharing more things all the time, it makes sense if you're already doing the work to assess the environmental, social, and the governance aspects of a certain investment, that you should be sharing those details as well. I think where the problem comes in is that, going back to my first point, where because the ESG space and the impact space, all of it is kind of mishmashed all together, people often think that because you call it an ESG, somehow it's all green. And sometimes it's not, right? And sometimes it's not about greenhouse gas reduction, and it's not really about adaptation, it's about safeguarding. And there may be a very strong social element that may not have any greenness to it, but it's still ESG kind of compliant or safeguarded in that way. So I would say the first step to understanding kind of ESG is to recognize it as one of the things that an investor has to do in order to come with the right result of what their investment is going to be in the long run, especially given the technologies that we have. And I don't think we can go back to a world where we, make investments without looking at these aspects.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the things we're picking up on is actually understanding what ESG is and what it really isn't. And because ESG is really three different concepts, right? I mean, the environmental, the social part of it, and the governance part put together. So sometimes it could get muddled a little bit. Why should we even care about ESG investment? I mean, most of the audience here today are students. And it's like when I went to Columbia Business School, the first thing they talk about in class was culture, so important. And my mind was like going, really? Like it's not about making profit. And it's sort of the same, I guess, for our students here today, who might have the same questions. Really, is ESG, why should I even care about it? And is it not just about profit? So maybe Bruce, you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, let me begin by saying that ESG, I think, has two good reasons for existing. And the first is about profit, or more specifically about having better risk-adjusted returns. And I think, Lane, you touched on this, that your investments have done very well using ESG strategy. And in fact, there's a fair bit of academic research today that shows that using an ESG strategy can improve your risk-adjusted returns or improve your alpha. And the reasons for this are many, but mostly it comes down to incorporating all the factors, all the material factors that can affect the value of an investment. And some of those ESG factors can be pretty material depending on what business you're in. That just makes you a smarter investor, frankly, and smarter investors tend to, ultimately do better. So, you should care about ESG if you care about having good investment returns. The other reason to care about ESG, of course, is related to its impact on addressing environmental, social, and governance reasons. Here, the evidence is much more mixed. And I think it comes back to that the sort of more commonly used version of ESG, and Stefan referred to this, is, it doesn't really honestly have a great deal of environmental, social, governance impact, because it's mostly about the business and the investors in those businesses being aware of the risks and trying to avoid those risks. So if you're aware, say, of climate change and, say, rising sea levels, that's a risk. Let's say if you're in a real estate business, you probably want to avoid that risk and not build in places that are going to have a lot of flooding. That's good as an investor. doesn't stop climate change in any way whatsoever. Now, if you take a more narrower view, a deeper view of ESG, which I think is what Lane is practicing. And in fact, when I write in my book, I call this thematic investing. So, it's different terms, they get a little mixed up, but don't worry about that. The key point is what does this mean? If you take a thematic focus and say, look, these are the themes I care about, say climate, and Lane, you mentioned health and some other food security and so on, and go deep into those themes and invest in businesses that are going to help address those issues. Let's say you invest in renewable energy businesses. This could be a good investment, and more renewable energy does help us address climate change, right? So I think the more narrow definition of ESG, the deeper definition, what I call thematic, if you care about the environment, you care about social governance issues, you should care about ESG as well.
Good. So picking up on that point, maybe because sometimes your values, because your ESG really represents a company's values, your personal founder's values or the leader's values. A lot of times you may feel like you have to do a trade-off, because it's very expensive implementing a green solution. Is that a binary answer to it? Is it a pure yes, you can only choose one, or is there really you can have it both? And maybe I'll throw that question out to Lane first.
Okay, that's a very good question, Jack. I think my view here is, if you only talk about ESG from the impact perspective, without really calculating the cost associated with it, without really counting in the profit we can generate or the risk-adjusted returns we can generate out of that, I think that's not going to fly over the long run, right? Because we need the consumers to be able to really afford that, and making consumers, both individual consumers or the enterprise customers, being willing to pay an extra amount of money for good impact is not going to be sustainable over the long run. And it's not easy to really sort of convince the consumers in the end. But I think what we found really is a huge difference over the last few years is we saw very strong tipping points, in sectors like electric vehicle, battery, solar, all those sectors, right? The key is, that's a point I made before I took returns. We need to really count in the cost associated with those products, the cost structure. So when the industry can really make the cost structure as competitive as the traditional business without the ESG elements, then I think that will really make a huge change. That's really the tipping point for for those industries. So that's the reason why I think, if you really look at, for example, the electric vehicle sector, right? Taking Tesla as an example, there are many other EV players like BYD, many other players in China. Those guys are becoming very successful. They're growing extremely fast. No doubt, Tesla is one of the really sort of the most successful companies in the world. They're making a huge amount of profit. So that's a point I want to make. So I think we need to really count in both the climate impact part and also the competitive cost structure and the profits, the risk-adjusted returns people can make out of that. And when we can combine all those elements together, that's going to make that, magic change. I think, that's the reason why today, I think starting from 2 or 3 years ago, especially today and that's going to last for the next 5, 10 years, probably even more than a decade. Today investing into ESG is not only a cost part of it. It's not only a social impact part of it. It's a great opportunity, tremendous opportunity, for investors, and it can generate really extraordinary returns. I was talking to a lot of global investors, LPs, that super returns. I sat on 2 panels with super returns, and all the investors today, they are looking for the next big thing after internet. And I think, especially the first E part, right? I mean, within ESG, the green energy, clean tech part is something more and more investors really view as one of the biggest opportunities after the internet. So I think that's going to make a huge change over time.
Thank you, Lane. So, Stefan, you mentioned earlier about disclosure, about transparencies. So I wonder about the data gaps, meaning that if normally when you invest in a company, you assume you have very solid financial data that audit data you can look at and make your decision. Are they available in the ESG space? Or if not, how do you invest without detailed, verifiable information?
Sure. So before I take that one, let me just try to maybe close off and tie it all together, because I think your audience, you're mentioning are students. So if you're a student, why do you care about ESG? I think there's really two reasons. Number one, it's because that's where the market is going. But because the market is going that way, but there's actually a lack of supply, if you could somehow shift your resume or shift your focus to have some ESG background, you'll probably be more likely to be hired, right? I think that's in essence what it is, right? I see this as an explosion in specialists that have this type of background. So I think in the market, this is probably the hottest area in the market for people to be hired in. Now, I think the students now are in a better position to understand why. So the financial markets has never been so influenced by headline risk as it is now, right? And you can get into the reasons why, and you can get into the reasons of fake news and not fake news, what's really real, all these biased, media channels, but you have a huge proliferation of media, and everyone has their, I wouldn't say truth, but everyone has their point of view and their narrative, right? So what Bruce is saying is, these are, you have to look at investments on a risk, adjusted basis. So if you're not factoring in some of these headline risks, then you're doing a really poor job in assessing and marketing basically the future value of these investments you make. I mean, even something simple as like Apple, which is the biggest company in the world, every time there's a hit on the news about some of the social inequalities that some of their manufacturing plants have, halfway around the world from the US, the stock market takes a hit, right? That is as direct as you can see, that headline risk when it comes to environmental social factors, which probably, like I said, 25 years ago wasn't really a factor, but now it is, because everything's so transparent, everything's so fast, and everything gets posted. It does kind of become a factor very quick. So I think that's the real reason. Those two, I would say, are the two main reasons why students should care. Back to the question on the data. Yes, the data part is really difficult. So taking a step back, so AIB, like other MDBs, we have built probably, I would say, 50 to 70 years of history on working with companies and a group of institutions in the developing kind of projects or developing developmental impact kind of investments. So what that allows us to do is have a bilateral relationship with them. So if we have an issue, for example, with the environment or with the social, then we will stop giving them money, right? So it would be that type of governance, like really hands-on. So our governance would be, hey, like, I'm not going to give you the next disbursement of capital until you can, work these things out. If you're going to take land from these, indigenous people and they're not getting fairly compensated, we're not going to release the next amount of money. If your contractor has some issues where their history isn't right and they're on some like blacklist, then we're not going to give you, the next disbursement of money. So we had this bilateral discussions. So in I would say the most emerging markets of all markets, the development banks has had this type of, I guess, ESG equivalent that we've had. But when we progress from that world, where on a bilateral loan basis, we can ask for, whatever we want to ask for, we'll usually have to get answers. And if you move to the capital markets world, where you have to rely on public data, and when you're buying secondary markets, you can't ask the issuers directly because, they're not really going to tell you, right? Then you're forced to rely on these data aggregators and data collectors. So for, I think, the developing world, it's been actually quite good. And for the developing world, especially for the companies that are listed in an index or that are part of an index, they're actually quite good. So if you look at some of the listing requirements, a lot of the companies that are listed are on the exchange, where the exchanges require you to have some sort of an ESG disclosure. And then you have, TCFD coming in, and you have all these kind of regulators who are asking you to disclose. The problem is the emerging markets and the companies in the emerging markets that are not necessarily on the index or not part of the main kind of index. That's where you'll get data gaps. So the way that AIB has been dealing with them is to go back to our original roots of being a bilateral lender, and we would, tell them, okay, like we will invest into capital, into your capital market offerings, but maybe we would also, look at lending to you on a private basis, so we can get the information that we need to have. But data or incompleteness of data is something that ESG, especially for emerging markets and for smaller companies, do have a hard time with.
Yeah, no, thank you for that very comprehensive view. So it's really hard to talk about return without really focusing on the risks. And I know, Bruce, you recently wrote a book on investing in the era of climate change. Perhaps you could shed some light on what are some of the most important climate-related ESG risks that investors should be thinking about, and perhaps follow that up with what suggestions you may have for leaders to navigate these trade-offs.
Sure. I'll just go through it briefly because it can be kind of in depth. But there are two types of risks with climate change. One is the physical risk, and that's kind of obvious, right? Climate change, we're going to have increasing heat waves and powerful storms and rising sea levels. In fact, there are two types of physical risks. There are the acute risks. This is things like, very severe heat wave or severe storm. And there's the chronic risks, which are things like rising sea levels, which will take decades, but as they rise, it's going to be a chronic problem. That's what everyone thinks of. They think climate change and risk, they think physical risk, but in fact, it's what we call the transition risks that for businesses are more serious. So what's a transition risk? Well, there are many different types. The first is policy. So as governments slowly take action on climate change, they are passing policies and will pass more policies, and policy affects business in many ways. And some of those policies may be positively affect business if you're in a certain industry, or negatively in others. Here in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is an enormous piece of policy that really affects a lot of businesses. The second one is, to me, the biggest transition risk is innovation, particularly technology innovation. So climate change is spurring a lot of companies to come up with new products and new ways of doing business. Lane spoke to some of them as companies that he's invested in. And for businesses, this can create a tremendous risk. Classic example, Lane was talking about electric vehicles. I mean, the rise of Tesla has really put many the more traditional incumbent automobile companies at risk. Losing market share. They fell way behind. Tesla, BYD, some of these companies, that transition risk for business is really about new technologies that are advancing and putting their incumbent business models at risk. And then the third transition risk is around consumers, consumer behavior, social norms, right? So there's research today that shows that consumers prefer to buy products they view as sustainable. They don't they don't really want to pay very much of a price premium, unfortunately, or maybe. But showing two products and they think, well, this one looks more sustainable to me, they will pick that one. That's the one they will buy. And so for companies, as sort of transitions, how consumer behavior changes creates a real risk. If you risk of losing your consumers, and changing social norms puts you at risk of losing your employees. So there's also research that shows that employees show a preference for working for companies they believe to be sustainable. In fact, one of my colleagues here at Columbia Business School, Vanessa Bourbano, she's done very interesting research in this area, showing this fact. And we see that anecdotally. My students, they want to work for the companies that are doing the right things for sustainability. In today's highly competitive world for hiring the best employees, this puts a company that's not good on these ESG factors and not thinking about climate change and, at risk of losing their best employees. So these transition risks, as climate change becomes more and more important, more serious, more businesses need to be aware of it. Those transition risks will really affect them in the years to come.
Yes, wonderful. So I recently read an article on Economist that there's this growing concern and backlash that ESG is more talk than action. It hasn't really seen any real or brought about any real social or environmental changes. What do you say to that, Lane? I mean, what have you seen among your investments? Is it more talk than action?
Well, I think I think in our investment today, I think it's not only cost, right? I mean, we actually really view ESG as a tremendous opportunity. I talk about sort of the green energy part, the EV supply chain. We have many successful portfolios today. A lot of them are going IPO. Many of them will become like a unicorn companies or multiple billion-dollar US dollar market cap companies over time. So I think certainly that's going to be a tremendous opportunity. But not only that, right? I mean, even if we talk about the social part, the out of ESG, I think there's tremendous opportunity there as well. But for example, taking food security as an example, I think Bruce just mentioned about the climate risk, right? I mean, the physical risk for the world. I think we might face food shortage, in the coming years, just really because the climate situation is getting worse. Russia-Ukraine war is creating more troubles for the global agriculture industry. So the food supply is going to be under pressure. And I think the population-wise for the world is already 8 billion. So in order to really sort of, provide enough food for this population, and I think it requires a lot of technology, right? And I think that really creates investment opportunities for investors as well. So I think similar situation to with the green energy space, and also things like affordable housing and healthcare as well. I think those things are certainly very important from the social perspective. So I think again, here's my view. I always really view this as opportunity, right? I mean, I always look at things from the positive side of it. Of course, we need to really sort of carefully manage all the risks associated with that as an investor, prudent investor. But I do think there's a tremendous opportunity. And also because the audience are students, I think my suggestion for the students is really think about what the world really needs over time, and really sort of take that. If you want to really get some career advice, take that as what you want to do over time, right? Doesn't matter if you want to be a successful investor, you want to be successful, entrepreneur, you want to start your own business. And I do think this is a tremendous opportunity for everybody. It's not only something, not only a cost part or additional burden, for investors. So that's the point I want to make.
Yeah, and that's a good point, which I want to delve in a little deeper into the nuances of it. I think all of the initiatives that you mentioned, solving the food issues and all the climate issues are important. There's no question about that. But is ESG the right approach to this? Is Wall Street the right people that can save us, from all these global problems, or companies, or should this be more of a regulatory type of solution to it? So I guess that is my real question. I'd like to get the panel's perspective on.
Okay, I think that's maybe Jack. That's a question for me.
Anybody could take that.
Okay, maybe let me just start off. I think my view here is I do think the government is playing an important role, really sort of having all those regulations. But I do want to sort of mention the transition risk that Bruce mentioned for a lot of traditional businesses. So if they really do not take this seriously, do not do the transition enough, unfortunately, their market share will be taken away for those companies who actually take this seriously as a tremendous opportunity, right? So I do think it's not only something that the government is imposing on the business. It's really sort of for a lot of the business leaders globally. They need to really take this seriously as some of those guys who take this as a tremendous opportunity got huge success, right? I mean, guys like Tesla, guys like BYD, CATL, that's $150 billion market cap companies in China, #1 battery company in the world. Many successful examples. Many of our portfolios will become multiple $billion market cap over time. So I think, my suggestion for all the audience here is, I think you need to take this more proactively as the opportunity, a lifelong opportunity. And I do believe as the investor investing into this sector, I think this is a very exciting opportunity after internet. So that's the reason why we are very focused on this. Actually, over the last more than a decade, we have been focused on this area personally by myself. So today, we're becoming sort of, all of our portfolios, I think they are becoming more and more successful. So I think I do think, this is our approach and our perspective.
Let me just add to what Elaine said. I think if we rely solely on the market to solve problems like climate change, we're going to fail. If we rely solely on government to solve these problems of climate change, we're going to fail too, right? It's a cooperation of good policy and business. Frankly, policy that sort of says this is the direction to go and sets those guidelines, and then business implements them. Business is really good at innovation, and business is really good at scale, but they need the incentives to do that. It won't happen purely with market forces.
I think that is an important takeaway. It'll take all of us to effect change. So maybe in terms of what actionable items our audience here can take away from today, really, I have two questions. One is in terms of raising awareness and capacity building, whether we're a student, we're working at a company, or we're leaders at a firm, what do you think could and should be done? And maybe even what kind of training might be available at Columbia? Bruce, you want to take that
first on the Columbia side, or okay, I'll talk to Columbia because it's easy for me to talk about the education side. The business side for Stefan and Lane is a little more challenging, I think. But the takeaway is, let me start with the fact that there's a lot of change going on, right? Climate change is frankly about change that's coming to our global economies, and these social changes and the like. These are really important changes that are coming. And with change, comes very exciting opportunities for young people, for students. This is what really opens up wonderful careers. So at Columbia University, what are we doing about this? On the climate side, we started a new school, the climate school, to focus exclusively on this. I'm also affiliated with the climate school in addition to the business school, though my home office is the business school. And this is sending a signal to students and those outside of the university about the importance. This is the first new school, I think, in about 40 or 50 years at Columbia. So it's a pretty big deal. We don't start a lot of schools. Within the business school, the relatively new dean, Dean McGlaris, and I have been working for the last 2 years, looking at the business school program and how do we prepare our students for these changes that are coming, particularly with respect to climate. And as of this fall, the core courses, which anybody who's been at Columbia Business School, you have to take the core. You have no choice about that. The majority of our core courses now have cases and lessons on climate change in the core. So every student has exposure to this. And now within the electives, we went from 2 electives on climate change topics to 5 this year. And next year we'll have 8 electives, which is a lot. That's an enormous amount of training. Why do we do this? Because quite simply, we taught business until recently based on the model of building the economy in the same fashion as we've done for the last 300 years. Right? It's the industrialization model. It's worked pretty well, right? I mean, it's created a quite nice prosperity for most people in the world, and those who don't have it yet are rising based on this market system that we teach in the business school. But there's a catch, and the catch is it's unsustainable. We keep doing this, we will be in a very, very bad situation 30 years from now. So after 300 years of really building the same economy and teaching that, we now have 30 years to completely decarbonize. And so this creates the greatest challenge for business and business schools, and also the greatest opportunity for business and business schools. And the last thing I would say is it's a little bit like, frankly, what's happened the last 30 years with technology. When I graduated from business school, this is 3 decades ago. The big thing that came at that time, and has been for 30 years now, is how technology, especially digital technology, has affected every business, right? If you're in business or you're in investments, you need to be aware of how technology affects your world. If you ignore it, you're not going to be very successful. Okay, that was the last 30 years. The next 30 years, you better be aware of climate change. And so that's what we're training our students to do.
Thank you, Bruce. Stephen and Ling, any thoughts for our audience about how to raise awareness and build their capacity?
Maybe I will take this one first. So I think as a practitioner, there's a couple of things you can do. I think one is just to read a lot. So you can start for climate, you can start with Paris Agreement. And then you can read the different interpretations of Paris Agreement. You can read the reports by IPCC in terms of the science behind it. And then what's been happening is that a lot of the community in the financial world is actually rapidly getting into it. So if you see some of the recent M&As that are happening in I would say in the rating agencies, they have been out there really buying a lot of these data providers that Jack was alluding to. So if you read the background of it, what's happening is you'll see that Moody's and S&P, they're starting to now publish reports, not only about the credit risk, but within the credit risk ratings and the justification, they'll start to incorporate data regarding about climate or ESG kind of factors. So those are some of the things that you can freely freely available, and I think people can read up, even if you're not a student. If you're a general practitioner like myself, just keep reading about what's happening. It's such a fast-moving space, and it's not a finite space at the moment, as in there is no end goal that has been achieved. It's very fluid, and it keeps on changing. That if you really want to keep up, then you really have to keep reading what's really going on in the markets. Now, the good thing about that is if you know a little bit, if you've been following it for about a year or two, then you sound really smart, right? So if you go into an interview and you are able to say some of these words and say some of these like, oh, I've seen the recent IPCC and the red heat zones coming up, and you sound really smart. So I would say keep your eyes open, and if you're interested, Google is a fascinating tool where it can find anything for you. And I would encourage everyone to read up on it, because it is a very, very fluid and fast moving space. And there's updates all the time.
Okay, I think my I want to give some recommendation advice to the audience here. The first point I want to make here is always actually think about the first principle, right? I mean, taking first principle as something, as a tool, an effective tool you can use to really sort of think about your career plan, right? Basically think about what this world really needs 20, 30 years from now, facing such a big climate challenge. And I think, and I think that could be really helpful. I think that's the first recommendation I want to make. The second one I want to make here is, I think try to understand the technology part of it. Even by talking to the smartest people of the world, try to find really insightful experts, things like that, right? And I think trying to understand technology trend is important, because that's the solution, to face such a big challenge. And that's in the green energy space, in the clean tech space, and in the food security space, in the healthcare space as well. So technology is the solution. So try to understand it better. And the third one I want to make here is, do not always view things ESG or climate challenge as a challenge. View that as opportunity. It's always like a challenge, opportunity are like two sides of the coin, right? I mean, they always coexist together, right? So be more proactive, take this as an opportunity, and then you will find your own solution. You will find your own path to your success. So those are really the recommendations I want to make.
Great. Those are absolutely all great advices, I think, for all of our people in our audiences. And I think for many of them, embarking either onto a brand new career or just starting out their lives, these are the issues they have to think about, is what kind of world they want to live in. I think the world is a lot more complicated now. It's much more than just making dollars and cents, but there's an added responsibility now to think about creating the world together. It doesn't take one individual, but it really takes all of us to get our vision happening. So there's a lot of distraction about ESG. Particularly, I think a gentleman by the name of Tamer Center, he ran BlackRock's sustainability investments, and he came out after 2 years and saying that ESG is a distraction, slowing real reform, and that returns aren't better. There's no positive impact on society. So that's his view. But I think from our discussion today, my takeaway is that it's all about how you do it. It's all about having that mentality that this is important and we have to think about this. And I think that's a mindset that hopefully our next generation of leaders will all be able to take with us. So final question that maybe I have for all of you is, as a student, like, or as a working professional, what are some of how do they participate in this? Whether you call it a movement, a mindset, or even specific ESG investment opportunities that they could go out today and start participating and helping push this forward. What are some things they could do?
Oh, maybe let me get started first. And after this one, I apologize that I need to run. I got another like AGM today for our LPs. So I think I think some recommendations here is I think there is certainly, as a business school student, you certainly have access to a lot of public information. There are many successful portfolios, public companies in these sectors, guys like Tesla, BYD. There are a lot of companies in that EV supply chain, battery supply chain, and all the leaders. I mean, taking hydrogen as an example, is a great area over time. Great investment area, over time. It's the cleanest energy. So taking some of those areas as a focus area for yourself, try to get as much information as possible and try to learn about it and try to really find the smartest people in the world and talk to them, learn from them. And I do think there are many things, many opportunities in that space. So you just need to be more practice and try to really sort of, try to learn more, get yourself better prepared for the future. And if you really have more knowledge base, at least, I mean, when you are, trying to find a job, or we are trying to, for example, start a business, that really helps you get better prepared as well. So I think, try to learn as much as possible based on the public information, try to learn as much as possible from the smartest people of the world, and find an area, focus area for yourself, and try to drill deeper into that. I think that will help you be better prepared for the future.
I would just add by saying, as Stefan said a few minutes ago, get smart on these topics. It's you can read about them, you can understand what is ESG really, how does it really work. As Stefan mentioned, you don't have to learn an awful lot to get smart about it, not just for your own personal good, but because if you really want to affect change, and this is what I teach my students, what you do personally is important, but what really makes a difference is how you affect your business, the company you work for. Because these issues, it's really companies that make these changes happen, these positive changes ultimately. And even if you're a fairly junior employee, at least being knowledgeable so that when there's a conversation in your company or there's an opportunity to talk about it, you can be smart and help influence the direction your company is going. Make sure that the more senior, the older leaders in the company understand how important this is and where the opportunities are as well. So I would go in that direction.
I would say buy Bruce's book. Read it.
It's very kind of you say. I will say, Stefan, the book is only in English right now, but my publisher informed me recently it is coming out in Chinese sometime next year. I don't know exactly when, but it will be available in Chinese.
Great. Maybe we can put a QR code somewhere to purchase your book.
It's available on Amazon or wherever you buy books.
Thank you. And I know Lane has to go for another meeting. So thank you very much, Lane. Please feel free to drop off at any time. At this point, we have a few questions from our audience. And I'm just going to read it out loud here. The first one is a multi-part question. How far do you believe global investment entities accept that ESG investments meet the inherent needs of sustainable economic and social development? What might help facilitate the popularization of this perception? And what are the most significant factors that are negatively affecting it?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. So when AIB first embarked on trying to get ourselves invested in the capital markets, and like I said, because our tradition is developmental finance, everything we did have to have some ESG angle to it, right? So we actually took a bit of a very straw man pool of the largest institutional investors in the world. So we just asked them, we called them up, we know them. And the answer was very interesting. So I don't know if all of them accept that ESG investment meets the needs of sustainable kind of, development goals, but they recognize that it's something that they're going to have to do in the next couple of years. So the question is, why won't they do it now? And I think from institutional investor side, what they're saying is, we don't want to overpromise, set up a system where we have to disclose, but we cannot come through with it. So from our understanding of kind of the sustainable kind of capital markets, or, or ESG investment in the capital markets, I think a lot of the institutional investors, if not all, are aware of the need to do it because of the peer pressure of everyone else looking to do it. The question is, when would they launch it? Now, the Europeans, especially the Northern Europeans, have really taken the lead on this one, and they have announced, a lot of claims to what they want to do. And I think everyone is watching very closely kind of how they go about doing it, because executing it is much more difficult than making promises of what they'll do and what they will not do. And if you have, a couple $100 million in your portfolio, turning it into the impact, or at least do no harms type of investment in your portfolio, is relatively easy. If you have billions, that's almost, you can't do that overnight. So I think they're aware of it. They just don't want to rock the boat so much that they'll sink. So they're waiting for the right time, once they have exited some of the positions, or at least clarify some of their positions, before probably announcing it.
Yeah, I wouldn't add anything to what Stefan had to say. I think he's got more familiarity with that issue.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Do you have any practical or applicable suggestions or steps for investment entities on how to incorporate ESG into their investment decisions, such as how to develop a set of index incorporating possible factors of ESG? It's not easy to translate the concept into real life work practice.
Let me make one simple point on this, and I think Stefan might have more points. It's quite complex, as the question alludes to. The simple point is this issue of what we call materiality. So there are many ESG factors, right? But for most companies, there's only a small number that matter, the ones that are material to that company or that investment, right? So, for some companies, if you're in the oil and gas industry today, clearly environmental factors around climate change is going to be very material to your business, right? For other companies, it's going to be very different factors. If you're in the mining industry, some of your social factors are going to matter if you're disturbing local communities and things like this, environmental as well. So first figure out what is material factors, and then you get to the hard part. Okay, how do we actually incorporate those factors into analysis? Don't find hundreds of factors that won't be helpful.
Yeah, so I would say get a corporate discount to buy Bruce's book. that's number one. And if you don't find answers there, then I would say there's a couple of resources that I think we've been advising our counterparties on, and one of them is work with UNPRI. So UN basically set up kind of principles of responsible investment, and then they spun that off. So now it's a completely separate kind of institution. And in 20 years, now they have something like 2,500 signatories. So what the signatory means is that every year you're going to publish a report, and you have 2 years to kind of get to that state where you can get to a good report. And in that report, you're basically going to disclose what you have and what you don't have, and what are some of the gaps you have. And I would say that process of being able to report is going to really help your investment entity, or the institutional investor, try to come to grips of what they can do and what they cannot do, and where the gaps are in terms of their investment process. So that's what we've been advising. That we also work with UNPRI, obviously, to kind of help institutional investors get to a good understanding of ESG issues on a very granular level. And I think that would be my number two answer.
Yeah, I agree. UNPRI has lots of great information, and you know, they really are the leaders in this area.